Marcus, don't reach into your jacket again.
I'm not reaching for anything.
Black Parole Officer Marcus Hill, you're being detained pending a federal corruption investigation.
For nearly 11 years, Marcus Hill worked inside one of the state's busiest parole districts. He supervised violent offenders and controlled decisions that changed.
This is insane.
We traced $75,000 to accounts tied directly to...
By the spring of 2024, Marcus Hill had become one of the most recognizable parole officers inside District 7 Community Supervision in North Franklin County. The state office sat on the third floor of an aging government complex on East Jefferson Avenue, wedged between traffic court and a child support enforcement division that constantly overflowed into the hallway. Most mornings, the building smelled like burnt coffee, copier toner, and damp carpet that never fully dried after years of leaking air conditioning units. Marcus moved through that environment with unusual calmness. At 42 years old, Black parole officer Marcus Hill had spent more than a decade supervising violent offenders, repeat narcotics cases, and high-risk parolees returning from state prison. Coworkers described him as patient, measured, difficult to rattle, while newer officers struggled to manage aggressive clients inside the crowded reporting lobby. Marcus had developed a reputation for talking people down before situations escalated. "You send Hill in when somebody's ready to explode," one former supervisor later told investigators. Most of the time he could calm them down. The work itself was chaotic. District 7 supervised nearly 3,000 active parolees with staffing levels designed for half that number. Officers bounced between field visits, violation hearings, urine screenings, halfway house coordination, and court appearances. Phones rang constantly. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead from 7 in the morning until closing. The waiting room television played daytime court shows while parolees argued quietly near vending machines under the watch of exhausted security officers. Inside that system, parole officers held enormous discretion. They could recommend curfew adjustments, approve housing transfers, delay violation filings, push for rehabilitation programs instead of jail sanctions. A single recommendation buried inside an electronic case file could change whether one stayed free or returned to prison. And in overloaded departments like District 7, supervisors often approved those recommendations quickly. Marcus understood that better than most. He carried himself professionally inside the office, button-down shirts, pressed slacks, expensive cologne noticeable in crowded hallways. He knew judges by name and remembered details about parolees' families that other officers forgot. In staff meetings, supervisors frequently pointed to his low confrontation numbers as evidence that his methods worked, but coworkers also noticed something else. Inmates seemed unusually comfortable around him. Some called him Marcus instead of Officer Hill. Others walked directly into his office without checking in at reception. A records clerk later recalled seeing parolees laughing with him behind partially closed doors while other officers struggled through tense compliance meetings nearby. At first, nobody treated it as suspicious. The department rewarded icers who kept parolees cooperative and out of jail. Marcus appeared to be doing exactly that. Still, small inconsistencies started surfacing. One parolee failed 3 consecutive drug tests but avoided a formal violation hearing. Another missed mandatory check-ins for nearly 2 months before receiving an unusually lenient supervision adjustment. A domestic violence offender caught violating electronic monitoring restrictions somehow remained on standard reporting status instead of being remanded. Each decision had paperwork supporting it. Each recommendation carried Marcus Hill's approval notes. Most supervisors signed off without asking questions. The office had become too overwhelmed to deeply audit individual case decisions. Compliance reviews were already backlogged by almost 6 months. Old desktop computers froze constantly while officers rushed through digital reports before deadlines. The system depended heavily on trust between supervisors and field officers, and Marcus had earned that trust. Outside work, though, some employees quietly started noticing changes. Marcus arrived one Monday driving a newer black GMC Yukon Denali with temporary tags still taped to the rear window. Weeks later, he showed up wearing a gold tag Heuer watch that several coworkers immediately recognized as expensive. Another officer joked about Marcus getting rich off state benefits, and the comment drew uncomfortable laughter around the break room microwave. State parole officers in Franklin County earned between $68,000 and $82,000 annually, depending on tenure and overtime. Marcus's lifestyle upgrades didn't exactly match that salary range, But corruption rumors inside corrections departments were common enough that most people ignored the signs. Some assumed he had family money. Others assumed overtime pay explained it. Nobody filed a complaint. What made the situation more dangerous was how ordinary Marcus continued to appear. He still attended Mandat, ORI training seminars, still volunteered for difficult caseloads, still stayed late finishing reports while custodians vacuumed empty hallways around him. If there was pressure building underneath the surface, he hid it well. Then, in August 2024, the department received an anonymous hotline complaint. The message was short. Just 3 sentences entered into an internal ethics reporting portal shortly after midnight. Officers need to look at Marcus Hill. Inmates are paying to stay free. Everybody inside knows it. The complaint initially went nowhere. Internal Affairs investigators categorized it as unsubstantiated due to lack of evidence. Anonymous accusations against parole staff appeared regularly, especially from disgruntled offenders facing violations. The file was logged, reviewed briefly, then pushed aside. But a compliance analyst named Rebecca Latham noticed something unusual while conducting a quarterly audit weeks later. Marcus Hill's name appeared repeatedly beside parole, modifications that statistically made little sense. High-risk offenders were receiving favorable recommendations at rates significantly above district averages. Several cases involved parolees with repeated violations who somehow avoided escalation penalties altogether. Rebecca printed 6 case summaries and spread them across her desk under the humming fluorescent lights of the compliance office. The deeper she reviewed the files, the stranger the pattern became. And for the first time, someone inside the department started wondering whether the anonymous complaint had been telling the truth. But the deeper investigators looked into Marcus Hill's case files, the more impossible the patterns became to ignore. Rebecca Latham didn't initially believe she had uncovered corruption. Sitting alone in the District 7 compliance office during a late Thursday audit shift, she assumed the parole modification patterns tied to Marcus Hill were probably the result of overloaded supervisors approved Ving paperwork too quickly. That happened constantly inside the department. Officers carried impossible caseloads. Deadlines piled up. Mistakes slipped through. But the numbers surrounding Black parole officer Marcus Hill kept resurfacing. By October 2024, Rebecca had expanded her review from 6 case files to nearly 43. She printed supervision histories across 3 years and pinned them beside each other on a gray cubicle wall under the hum of fluorescent lights. Certain names repeated over and over. Repeat offenders with failed drug screens, violent offenders who missed mandatory reporting dates, men flagged for gang contact violations who somehow remained on reduced supervision status. None of it made procedural sense. One file immediately stood out. 34-year-old parolee Darnell Whitaker had failed 4 narcotics screenings in 7 months, including 2 positives for fentanyl. Under department policy, a 3rd failed test normally triggered a formal violation hearing, NG and temporary detention recommendation. But every escalation request connected to Whitaker had been downgraded by Marcus before reaching supervisors. Marcus's notes described Whitaker as showing progress. Investigators later discovered the 2 men exchanged more than 63 phone calls outside official office hours over a 5-month period. Another parolee, 19-year-old Jamal Red, had been detained during a traffic stop near South Linden Avenue after officers discovered a loaded Glock pistol beneath the passenger seat. Red was prohibited from possessing firearms under parole restrictions. Internal policy classified the violation as severe enough to justify immediate revocation proceedings. Instead, Marcus recommended continued community supervision. The recommendation included language claiming Red was cooperative and unlikely to reoffend. When auditors checked office communication logs, they found Marcus and Reed had spoken repeatedly during the 48 hours leading up to the violation hearing. That detail changed the direction of the investigation. By November, the case quietly moved beyond internal compliance review and into the Public Integrity Division of the Franklin County Inspector General's office. 2 white investigators from the division, Daniel Mercer and Elise Granger, began reconstructing Marcus Hill's financial activity alongside his parole decisions. The financial records raised immediate concerns. Marcus earned approximately $76,000 annually before overtime. Yet bank statements showed recurring cash deposits inconsistent with his salary history. Investigators identified structured deposits ranging between $400 and $1,800 appearing across multiple accounts every few weeks. Almost none exceeded federal reporting thresholds. That detail immediately stood out to investigators trained in financial concealment cases. Subpoenaed banking records later showed black suspect Marcus used at least 3 separate checking accounts, 1 prepaid debit service, and multiple peer-to-peer payment applications registered under slight name variations. Some transfers moved through relatives before eventually landing in Marcus's accounts days later. On paper, the transactions looked disconnected, but timelines started aligning with parole outcomes. On February 12, 2023, surveillance footage from a Quick Mart convenience store on East Bradley Street captured a woman, later identified as Whitaker's cousin, depositing $900 in cash into an ATM at 8:14 p.m. 41 minutes later, Marcus accessed Whitaker's supervision file remotely from his county-issued laptop. 3 days after that deposit, Whitaker avoided a formal violation sanction. Another surveillance sequence came from a gas station near Interstate 44. Time-stamped footage showed Jamal Red entering the store at 10:22 p.m., followed minutes later by an unidentified male wearing a hooded sweatshirt who deposited cash into a green dot-linked ATM account tied indirectly to Marcus Hill. The next morning, Marcus submitted a recommendation reducing Reed's supervision restrictions. By December, investigators had started mapping transaction timelines on large printed spreadsheets spread across a conference table inside the Inspector General's office. Yellow highlights connected cash deposits. Blue marks tracked parole rulings. Red circles identified phone calls between Marcus and offenders before hearings. The patterns kept repeating. And then the investigation gained its first insider witness. 28-year-old parolee Travis Bogan had recently been arrested on burglary charges after cutting off his ankle monitor during a weekend trip to Dayton. Facing additional prison time, Bogan agreed to speak with investigators inside Interview Room B at the Franklin County Detention Center. The room was cold, windowless, and loud, with distant inmate yelling echoing through concrete corridors outside. At first, Saturday, Bogan avoided direct accusations. He sat with his arms folded tightly across his chest while investigators slid case files across the metal table. Eventually, after several minutes of silence and the steady hum of the ventilation system overhead, he started talking. According to Bogan, inmates inside District 7 openly discussed paying Marcus for favorable treatment. Missed drug tests allegedly carried one price. Curfew changes carried another. Halfway house transfers cost more. Early release paperwork was considered expensive because of the approval risk involved. He never asked direct, Bogan told investigators quietly. It was always through somebody else. Bogan claimed parolees used girlfriends, cousins, and friends to move cash through payment apps or ATM deposits to avoid detection. Investigators later verified portions of his account against financial records already collected. That was the moment the case stopped looking isolated. Investigators began pulling dozens of additional supervision files tied to Marcus Hill. The number of questionable rulings expanded rapidly. Some offenders had received repeated leniency despite behavior that normally triggered incarceration recommendations almost automatically. Meanwhile, Marcus continued reporting to work every morning. Co-workers later recalled seeing him lecture parolees about personal accountability, while standing beneath faded motivational posters inside the reporting lobby. He still conducted compliance meetings, still signed violation paperwork, still shook supervisors' hands in morning briefings, while investigators quietly reconstructed what prosecutors would later describe as a years-long bribery operation. But behind the scenes, federal authorities were already escalating the case. After reviewing phone logs tied to Marcus's county-issued device and personal cell phone records, investigators discovered dozens of late-night calls with active parolees outside authorized contact windows. Some converge. Rations lasted only seconds. Others stretched beyond 20 minutes shortly before major supervision decisions. In January 2025, prosecutors finally approved electronic monitoring authorization. And once federal agents started listening to those calls, the investigation exploded. The first intercepted calls sounded almost meaningless. Federal agents assigned to the Franklin County Public Integrity Task Force spent days inside a cramped monitoring room on the 6th floor of the federal building downtown, listening to routine conversations from black parole officer Marcus Hill's county-issued cell phone. Most of the recordings involved scheduling changes, missed appointments, or ordinary supervision discussions. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead 24 hours a day, while analysts typed notes into case management software beside half-empty coffee cups. and stacks of subpoena returns. Then the language started repeating. Paperwork handled. Stay clean for a week. Bring the package. Investigators immediately noticed the phrasing appeared most often before favorable parole decisions. One recorded call from January 18, 2025, involved Marcus and parolee Darnell Whitaker shortly after another failed narcotics screening. Whitaker sounded nervous. His voice cracked repeatedly over the line while traffic noise echoed in the background. "So, we still good?" Whitaker asked quietly. Marcus paused for nearly 4 seconds before answering. "Just stay out the way this week." "And the report?" Another pause. "It's handled." The violation report tied to Whitaker disappeared from escalation review less than 48 hours later. Federal prosecutors would later argue Marcus intentionally avoided direct references to money or favors. Conversations rarely included explicit language. Instead, investigators heard vague instructions, clipped responses, and long stretches of silence where both parties seemed careful not to say too much. Another call drew even more attention. At 9:2 p.m. on February 3rd, parolee Travis Bogan contacted Marcus from a prepaid cell phone investigators had already linked to prior ATM deposits. Audio records captured Bogan asking whether his cousin could drop that thing off tomorrow. Marcus lowered his voice immediately. "Not at the office." 8. Same spot? "Yeah, early." The call lasted 23 seconds. The next morning, surveillance teams observed Marcus pulling into the rear parking lot of a Marathon gas station off Interstate 44, just before sunrise. Dashboard camera footage from an undercover vehicle positioned across the street showed a silver Honda Accord entering the lot 6 minutes later. A male subject exited briefly, leaned into Marcus's passenger side window, then walked away carrying nothing. Marcus remained parked another 30 seconds before driving directly to District 7. Agents later reviewed nearby business surveillance frame by frame. One still image appeared to show an envelope sliding across the St. Air console. Individually, moments like that proved little. Together, they started building structure. By February, investigators had established what one federal affidavit later described as an evidence ladder. First came the suspicious supervision approvals, then the unexplained financial deposits, then inmate testimony, then recorded calls. Finally, physical surveillance tying those elements together in real time. The deeper agents looked, the more routine the behavior appeared. Marcus rarely met parolees directly inside obvious locations. Instead, prosecutors alleged he relied on intermediaries, cousins, girlfriends, childhood friends, women listed nowhere inside official parole documentation. Meetings happened in transitional spaces where brief contact looked ordinary. Strip mall parking lots, convenience stores, fast food drive-thrus. One surveillance report documented Marcus arriving at a Chinese takeout restaurant on West Colonial Drive at 8:17 p.m. on February 11th. Video cap. Heard him entering alone carrying a black leather folder. 7 minutes later, a woman connected to parolee Jamal Red entered separately, sat briefly across from him, then left after less than 2 minutes. When Marcus exited the restaurant, the folder appeared visibly thicker beneath his arm. Inside District 7, however, daily operations continued almost normally. Supervisors remained overwhelmed by staffing shortages and growing caseloads. Internal audits were months behind schedule. The department's aging case management software lacked automatic flagging systems for repeated override recommendations. Officers could modify supervision notes without triggering immediate review unless another employee specifically checked the file history. That failure became critically important. Investigators later discovered Marcus had overridden or softened at least 17 violation recommendations that normally would have triggered supervisory review. But because District 7 processed the thousands of monthly entries, nobody noticed the concentration forming around his caseload. Some coworkers refused to believe the allegations entirely. He was one of the calmest officers in the building, one parole specialist later told investigators during an internal interview. If Marcus was dirty, nobody saw it. Others were less surprised. A veteran compliance officer admitted she had privately questioned Marcus's unusually close relationships with parolees for years, but feared reporting concerns without proof. Another employee recalled overhearing inmates refer to Marcus as the fix. Still, nobody inside the office had imagined the investigation had already reached federal surveillance levels. Marcus himself appeared increasingly cautious during recorded calls. He shortened conversations, avoided specific language, sometimes allowed long periods of silence before responding to requests. But pressure changes behavior, and investigators believe that pressure finally caused Marcus to make a mistake. On March 6, 2025, agents began monitoring Parole Leonard Graves, a repeat offender facing a major violation hearing tied to suspected narcotics trafficking. Graves had already failed electronic monitoring compliance and missed mandatory reporting appointments. Internal policy strongly supported revocation. 2 nights before the hearing, agents intercepted a short call between Graves and Marcus. "My aunt gonna bring it," Graves said. Marcus answered carefully. "Tell her don't stay long." The following evening, surveillance teams positioned around the Riverside Family Diner parking lot on Mason Street captured what prosecutors would later describe as the clearest evidence in the investigation. At 7:13 p.m., Marcus arrived alone in his GMC Yukon and parked near the rear dumpsters away from the restaurant entrance. Rainwater reflected across the pavement beneath flickering parking lot lights, while undercover agents watched from 2 unmarked vehicles nearby. 7 minutes. Utes later, a woman identified as Graves's aunt approached Marcus's driver's side window carrying a large manila envelope. The interaction lasted less than 15 seconds. Investigators later stated the woman leaned partially into the vehicle, exchanged brief words with Marcus, then passed the envelope through the window before walking away quickly, without entering the diner. Marcus placed the envelope inside his leather case folder almost immediately. 3 days later, Leonard Graves avoided formal detention despite multiple violations that normally carried immediate incarceration recommendations. For investigators, that sequence changed everything. Federal agents now believed they had direct surveillance linking cash exchanges to parole outcomes. Prosecutors quietly began discussing arrest strategies with the U.S. Attorney's Office while additional search warrant applications moved through sealed federal review. But investigators still faced one problem. The evidence strongly suggests de-corruption. What they still needed was a transaction impossible for Marcus Hill to explain away. Federal prosecutors believed they finally had enough evidence to bring Marcus Hill down, but they still needed one final mistake. By March 2025, federal investigators believed they understood how Marcus Hill operated. What they still needed was proof impossible to explain away in court. Recorded calls suggested corruption. Surveillance footage suggested cash exchanges. Financial records showed suspicious deposits. But prosecutors wanted something cleaner, something immediate, a controlled transaction tied directly to Black parole officer Marcus Hill himself. That decision led investigators toward a federal sting operation. The cooperating witness was 29-year-old parolee Travis Bogan, the same offender who had previously admitted inmates discussed paying Marcus inside District 7. Bogan was already facing additional prison exposure tied to burglary charges and electronic interrogating violations. According to later court filings, federal agents approached him with a cooperation agreement in exchange for consideration during sentencing. The preparation process took nearly 2 weeks. Inside a secured evidence room at the Franklin County Federal Building, agents photographed stacks of marked currency beneath fluorescent processing lights, while evidence technicians logged serial numbers into chain of custody forms. Audio technicians tested concealed recording devices repeatedly to avoid signal failures. Surveillance teams studied parking structures surrounding District 7 and nearby government offices searching for locations with limited civilian interference. Every step had to survive courtroom scrutiny later. On March 24th, prosecutors obtained sealed operational authorization for a controlled bribery exchange. Agents wired Bogan with hidden audio equipment disguised beneath a gray hooded sweatshirt, while another recording device was secured inside his vehicle. Investigators instructed him carefully. Do not pressure Marcus. Do not introduce new criminal language. Allow Marcus to control the conversation. The goal was documentation, not entrapment. At 3:16 p.m. on March 27th, Bogan placed the monitored call from inside an undercover FBI vehicle parked behind a warehouse district near Franklin Avenue. Rain tapped lightly across the windshield while agents listened through headsets beside him. Bogan sounded anxious. "They saying I'm getting violated tomorrow," he told Marcus quietly. "I can't go back in." Marcus exhaled slowly before responding. "You should have handled this earlier." I know, I'm trying now." Several seconds passed. Then Marcus lowered his voice. "Can you still take care of it?" Bogan answered immediately. "Yeah. Then we'll work something out." The meeting was scheduled for that evening. Investigators selected a dimly lit parking garage attached to the old municipal records building on Grant Street, less than 2B, blocks from the parole office. The structure stayed relatively empty after business hours and offered multiple surveillance angles from upper levels. By 6:40 p.m., undercover vehicles were already positioned throughout surrounding streets while surveillance teams occupied adjacent stairwells carrying long-range cameras. Inside the command vehicle, agents monitored live audio feeds through static bursts and occasional microphone distortion. At 7:03 p.m., black suspect, Marcus Hill, entered the garage driving his black GMC Yukon. Security camera footage later showed him parking on the third level near a malfunctioning overhead light that flickered every few seconds against the concrete ceiling. Bogan arrived 4 minutes later. The garage was quiet, except for distant traffic echoing through the open structure and the low mechanical hum of ventilation fans overhead. Surveillance photographs later showed Marcus standing beside his vehicle holding the same black leather case folder agents had repeatedly observed during prior exchanges. Bogan approached slowly. "You got me?" Marcus asked. "Yeah. You sure it's all there?" Bogan nodded and handed him a large sealed envelope containing $5,000 in marked currency supplied by federal investigators. Marcus opened the folder immediately and slid the envelope inside without counting the money. Audio recordings captured paper shifting against leather. Then the conversation turned toward parole paperwork. "You lay low for a couple weeks," Marcus told him. "Don't miss nothing else." "And the warrant?" "I said I got it." The exchange lasted less than 90 seconds. Agents listening live from nearby surveillance vehicles immediately confirmed probable cause thresholds had been met. Multiple teams began mobilizing simultaneously while Marcus drove back toward District 7, carrying the marked cash inside his case folder. Federal prosecutors later stated investigators intentionally delayed the arrest for several minutes to preserve continuity between the transaction and evidence recovery. At approximately 7:21 p.m., Marcus entered the third-floor parole office using his county-issued badge. Several employees were still inside finishing reports beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting of the nearly empty office. A printer hummed near the records desk, while a television mounted in the waiting area played muted local news coverage. Marcus appeared calm. Bodycam footage later released during court proceedings showed him walking down the hallway carrying a leather folder beneath his arm, before two federal agents intercepted him near the supervisor offices. "Marcus, don't reach into your jacket again." "I'm not reaching for anything." Black parole officer Marcus Hill. "You're being detained pending a federal corruption investigation." Marcus froze briefly. "This is insane." Agents recovered the marked currency from inside the folder almost immediately. Coworkers slowly emerged from nearby offices as the hallway fell silent except for radio chatter and the soft crackle of bodycam microphones. One administrative clerk later described hearing somebody quietly whisper, "Oh my God," near the copier room as agents removed Marcus's county badge. Marcus remained outwardly controlled, but footage showed visible tension building across his face. He repeatedly insisted investigators had misunderstood the situation. "You got the wrong person. We traced $75,000 tied to you," one agent responded. Marcus looked down toward the carpet before speaking again. "I want a lawyer." The arrest spread through the building within minutes. Parolees waiting downstairs reportedly began discussing rumors before agents had even finished processing evidence upstairs. Some inmates pulled out cell phones in the lobby, while county employees quietly watched federal vehicles gathering outside the government complex. By 8:14 p.m., local police scanners had already circulated word of a federal public co-rupture arrest connected to District 7 community supervision. Then the media arrived. The first television alert appeared just after 9 o'clock during an evening broadcast interruption on Channel 4 News. Parole officer accused of selling freedom for cash. The following morning, federal prosecutors formally announced charges against Marcus Hill including bribery, honest services fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction-related allegations tied to what investigators described as a long-running corruption scheme involving active parolees under state supervision. But the arrest was only the beginning because investigators soon uncovered how many dangerous offenders may have benefited from the scheme. 3 days after his arrest, Marcus Hill entered federal court wearing a dark gray suit, shackles hidden beneath the defense table. The atmosphere inside courtroom 5B felt unusually tense even before proceedings began. Reporters filled nearly every bench along the back wall while courthouse SE deputies quietly moved spectators through metal detectors outside the chamber. The HVAC system rattled overhead. Folders scraped against wooden tables. Nobody inside the room spoke above a whisper once Black parole officer Marcus Hill was escorted through the side entrance. The indictment itself stretched nearly 40 pages. Federal prosecutors accused Marcus of accepting more than $75,000 in bribes from active parolees and their associates over several years, while manipulating supervision outcomes inside District 7 community supervision. The charges included bribery, conspiracy, honest services fraud, and obstruction-related allegations tied to falsified reporting and concealed financial activity. Marcus listened silently as prosecutors summarized the accusations during the initial bond hearing. Occasionally, he leaned toward his attorney, speaking quietly behind one raised hand. Otherwise, his expression remained controlled, almost detached. He avoided Lou King toward the media gallery entirely. Prosecutors argued Marcus presented both a flight risk and an ongoing public corruption concern because investigators were still reviewing dozens of parole files tied to his recommendations. Defense attorneys countered that Marcus had deep community ties, no prior criminal history, and had voluntarily remained in Franklin County, despite learning he was under investigation weeks earlier. He's being portrayed as the face of institutional failure, defense attorney Richard Vallon told the court. But suspicion and assumptions are not convictions. The judge eventually approved conditional release pending trial, including electronic monitoring and surrender of Marcus's law enforcement credentials. Outside the courthouse, television cameras immediately surrounded both legal teams. Within days, federal investigators began turning over discovery evidence. The volume was enormous: financial spreadsheets, surveillance logs, ATM photographs, audio transcribed, IPTs, internal parole records, recorded phone calls, search warrant affidavits. Prosecutors later estimated the evidence database contained more than 18,000 pages of material, alongside hundreds of hours of recorded surveillance and intercepted communications. By the time trial proceedings formally began in September 2025, public interest had grown significantly beyond Franklin County. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors built the case methodically. They started with the paper trail. Large digital monitors positioned beside the jury box displayed banking charts showing recurring cash deposits flowing through accounts tied to Marcus Hill. Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Kessler walked jurors through transaction timelines slowly, often pausing to compare deposit dates against parole modification approvals entered into District 7's supervision system. The patterns became difficult to ignore. On multiple occasions, prosecutors showed cash deposits occurring within hours or days of favorable parole decisions involving the same offenders connected through call logs or witness testimony. Defense attorneys argued the financial evidence lacked context. They claimed many transactions represented personal loans, family assistance, side contracting income, or informal repayments unrelated to parole decisions. During cross-examination, Marcus's attorneys repeatedly emphasized that no deposit slip explicitly identified illegal payments, but prosecutors had more than financial records. They had the calls. Courtroom speakers crackled softly as jurors listened to intercepted conversations between Marcus and parolees. The recordings sounded ordinary at first, calm, controlled, but prosecutors carefully replayed phrases investigators believed carried coded meaning. Paperwork handled. Stay clean for a week. Bring the package. One juror reportedly took notes continuously during the audio presentations, while another stared directly at Marcus throughout the playback. Us rarely looked up. Instead, he sat rigidly beside his attorneys, occasionally rubbing his hands together beneath the defense table while avoiding eye contact with witnesses. Then came the surveillance footage. Federal prosecutors displayed video clips frame by frame across large courtroom monitors. Grainy parking lot recordings showed Marcus meeting parolees and intermediaries near gas stations, strip malls, and restaurant parking areas. One sequence from the Riverside family diner became especially important. Jurors watched repeatedly as Leonard Graves's aunt approached Marcus's vehicle carrying the manila envelope investigators alleged contained cash. The footage itself contained no audio, but prosecutors synchronized the video with intercepted calls from earlier that evening discussing bringing it before the violation hearing. Defense attorneys attacked the interpretation aggressively. "You cannot see money in this video," Vallon argued before the jury. "You cannot hear a bribe. What you are seeing is assumption layered on top of assumption." The government's strongest emotional testimony came from inside the parole department itself. Several District 7 supervisors admitted under oath that internal oversight systems had failed badly. One administrator described compliance staffing shortages so severe that supervisors routinely approved dozens of recommendations daily without detailed review. Another supervisor appeared visibly uncomfortable while explaining how Marcus's override patterns escaped detection. "We trusted our officers," she testified quietly. The system depended on that trust. The testimony damaged the department publicly. But the most difficult moment arrived later in the trial when prosecutors introduced the consequences tied to one parolee who allegedly benefited from Marcus's intervention. 32-year-old offender Jamal Red had avoided detention despite repeated firearm violations tied to Marcus's recommendations. Months later, Rhea D. was arrested following a violent armed robbery outside a convenience store that left a store clerk permanently injured. Inside the courtroom, the victim's family sat silently through portions of the testimony. One relative later told reporters outside the courthouse, "We kept asking why he was still free." The defense objected repeatedly to portions of the testimony, arguing Marcus could not be held legally responsible for unrelated future crimes committed by parolees. The judge limited some details but allowed prosecutors to establish the broader supervision history tied to Reed's case. Meanwhile, inmate witnesses created another layer of tension. Parolees like Travis Bogan testified about alleged cash-for-favor conversations, while defense attorneys aggressively challenged their credibility. Criminal histories were displayed openly. Cooperation agreements were dissected line by line. Jurors heard repeated arguments that inmates facing prison exposure had every incentive to fabricate accusations against Marcus Hill. At one point during cross-examination, Vallon leaned forward and asked Bogan directly, "You expect this jury to believe you suddenly developed a conscience?" Bogan hesitated. "No," he answered quietly. "I think they should believe the recordings." That response shifted the room noticeably. As the trial entered its final week, the courtroom gallery became increasingly crowded with former co-workers, reporters, and community observers. Security deputies monitored overflow seating in nearby hallways while media trucks remained parked outside the federal courthouse from early morning through evening recess. Marcus appeared more exhausted as proceedings continued. He whispered frequently with attorneys, drank water constantly, occasionally stared downward during witness testimony without reacting at all. But when prosecutors replayed portions of the sting operation audio during closing arguments, observers noted Marcus visibly tightening his jaw, while jurors listened in complete silence. Deliberations lasted less than 2 full days. On November 18, 2025, jurors returned guilty verdicts on the majority of federal corruption charges against Marcus Hill, including bribery, conspiracy, and honest services fraud. Marcus closed his eyes briefly as the verdicts were read aloud. Behind him, several former co-workers quietly lowered their heads while courthouse reporters rushed into hallways preparing breaking news alerts for evening broadcasts across the state. But even after the conviction, the fallout inside the parole system was far from over. Marcus Hill returned to federal court for sentencing on February 6, 2026. By then, nearly 11 months had passed since his arrest inside District 7 community supervision. The public attention surrounding the case had faded somewhat from nightly headlines, but inside Franklin County's justice system, the damage remained impossible to ignore. The courthouse atmosphere that morning felt heavy and unusually quiet. Court security had increased due to media presence and ongoing public criticism surrounding the parole department. Deputy marshals stood near every entrance, while reporters waited outside the federal building in freezing rain, hoping to capture footage of Black parole officer Marcus Hill entering through the side security corridor. Inside courtroom 5B, the same room where jurors convicted Marcus weeks earlier, prosecutors prepared for sentencing with thick binders stacked across the government table. Several former District 7 employees sat silently near the back row, avoiding reporters and refusing interview requests during breaks. Marcus entered wearing a navy suit that appeared noticeably looser than it had during trial. Observers later described him as exhausted. His posture remained upright, but the controlled confidence he once carried inside the parole office seemed mostly gone. He spent much of the hearing staring downward at legal paperwork while occasionally whispering brief comments to defense attorney Richard Vallon seated beside him. Behind Marcus, Several family members sat quietly holding tissues as courtroom deputies moved through final security procedures. Federal prosecutors argued the sentence needed to reflect more than financial corruption alone. Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Kessler told the court Marcus had sold access to freedom itself by allowing dangerous offenders to bypass accountability in exchange for cash payments. Prosecutors emphasized that parole officers occupied one of the most trusted positions inside the criminal justice system because their recommendations directly affected public safety decisions. The defendant was not stealing office supplies, Kessler told the judge. He was manipulating incarceration outcomes. Prosecutors also referenced parolees, who allegedly benefited from Marcus's intervention despite repeated violations involving narcotics, firearms, and gang activity. Several reopened supervision. Reviews remained ongoing at the time of sentencing. Defense attorneys requested leniency. They argued Marcus had no violent criminal history, remained employed for years without disciplinary findings, and still maintained support from portions of his family and community. Vallon described Marcus as a man whose judgment collapsed under pressure, not a career criminal motivated purely by greed. But the judge appeared unconvinced. When U.S. District Judge Harold Benton finally addressed the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Even reporters stopped typing for several moments as the judge reviewed the broader institutional consequences tied